The 16-bit console generation has one of my favorite pixel art aesthetics out there. With their expanded color palettes, more detailed settings, and bigger character sprites, games on consoles like the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo elevated much of what I loved visually about growing up with the NES. Front Mission Gun Hazard's dramatic sunsets or Terranigma's dreamy landscapes are some notable examples, but occasionally that beauty extended to other genres as well. Around this time in the history of gaming, video games boasting amazing graphics created an expectation of overall good quality across the whole experience. With that in mind, let's have a look at Ardy Lightfoot. The storytelling in this little adventure is really quite endearing. The game opens with a short playable introduction where you navigate an ambiguously mammalian main character named Ardy and his best friend Peck through a cave to recover a stone tablet. During a lightning-fast text scroll with the slate's interpretation that I could barely keep up with, it's revealed that reuniting 7 lost rainbow pieces comes with the reward of a lucrative single wish. I expected that this opening cutscene would be the first and last of the storytelling as it is in most other platformers, but I was pleasantly surprised by how much more was in store. I regularly got filled in about the goings-on with Ardy's friend Nina or the great adventurer Don Jacoby, to name a few. These intermissions also revealed the plans of Visconti, the main antagonist of the game, who, according to the manual, is so incredibly evil that all he ever does are evil things. That's not somebody that you want to be messing around with. He's also after the rainbow pieces and understandably wants Ardy dead, but there are a surprising number of other people outside of Visconti's band that also want our hero to suffer. I have no idea what this sweet little face did to make so many people angry, and unfortunately for my curiosity, that's one place the story never takes us. The journey split up into several major areas that are pretty predictable as far as video games go. You can expect the usual forests, caves, and ancient ruins, as well as a trip on a pirate ship. There's even a brief trek through a giant organism's gastrointestinal tract in case anyone was vying for a dark and moist change of pace from the beautiful scenery. I mentioned that the graphics were one of the things that initially drew me to Ardy Lightfoot, but saying it's a good-looking game would be an understatement. Every scene is incredibly vibrant with lots of little details to bask in. Mossy bricks in the ruins or little cracks with flowing water in the cave floors are only a couple of the ways these settings shine brightly among a sea of other games that took a more generic approach to their visuals. I wish I could say that every level was a feast for the eyes, but some areas were considerably less refined than others. For example, the pirate ship decks are rather plain when compared to something like the forest stage, which has several layers in it. There's the high contrast foreground vines, as well as some buildings nestled in the distance in the thick of the trees. What stood out to me the most, though, was the attention the artists paid to lighting. It was such a treat to see how the flickering of fire affected the features around a torch, or how realistic some of the shadowing looked. It really dressed up some of the drearier indoor areas, particularly Visconti's castle. On the auditory end of the experience, the music had this epic or heroic quality to it that I really liked. The soundtrack was fantastic, but it didn't always match the tone of what was going on in the game. Many of the tracks felt more akin to something you'd hear as the backdrop of a grand adventure in a medieval setting rather than an accompaniment for this bumbling pair hitting the road. The character sprites are lovely. Ardy has quite a few animations and stances, depending on what he's up to, but as charming as he was, I think my favorite characters to see in action were the members of Visconti's army. They're these little mohawk-wearing bird-like enemies, at least I think that's what they're supposed to be. They have a bunch of different actions and even alternate their get-ups depending on the level theme. The one sporting little hard hats running these Ferris wheels of doom in the mining stage stole my heart, with the snorkelers not far behind. I think the artists must have put all their best ideas into every other character in the game apart from Peck, because he's pretty generic by comparison. In his base form, he opens up his toothy, terrifying little maw as he flies through the air at enemies when he's deployed as a projectile attack. The rest of the time, he's just a roundie cycling through a couple of animation frames as he bounces along behind Ardy. He's very cute, but he doesn't seem as fleshed out as other stuff going on screen. In terms of its level design, Ardy Lightfoot was all over the place. On the one hand, there were a few stages that were very easy to cruise through that were mainly horizontal segments with straightforward platforming. These were a breeze compared to others on the opposite end of the spectrum that were maze-like, precision-requiring slogfests that extracted life after life out of me as I tried to pull off that one perfect run. Overall, I'd say the game feels a bit too zoomed in, which made indoor areas where movement was more restricted especially challenging. It's not like that's anything new for the Super Nintendo though. This game, like many other titles on the console, suffers from having huge sprites that are difficult to get out of the way of just about everything. I'll be fully transparent here and admit that a lot of my own personal struggles with the gameplay came down to control issues. I'll elaborate more on that shortly, but first, I'd like to discuss the constant barrage of ever-changing level gimmicks that tripped me up. Now, I will gladly embrace gimmicks in games when they're executed thoughtfully and enhance the experience. While Ardy Lightfoot has some good elements in principle, one of my biggest gripes is that it experiments a little too much. For example, in one level you'll need to use reflections on the ground in order to be able to see and react to otherwise invisible projectiles. This is an interesting and even innovative concept, but it's one of several mechanics you endure one time and never again. Flitting from idea to idea effectively strips Ardy Lightfoot of any teachable moments, something I feel is critical in platformer design. At times, playing this one felt like I was up to bat in a baseball game where the pitcher kept throwing one curveball after another, and just when I thought I'd figured out how to hit a baseball, the next inning the pitcher started throwing tennis balls, followed by footballs. Eventually, by the ninth, they were tossing ninja stars and grenades. When the ball's always changing like this, you don't know whether to swing at it, run away, or take cover. In platformers, learning a new skill and refining that knowledge all the way through later parts of the game provides a satisfying sense of progression. Ardy Lightfoot was almost completely devoid of that. By forcing its players to constantly tackle new challenges, the game amounts to an experience that lacks cohesion and feels disconnected as a whole. Even more trying were the character controls. Basic directional movement on solid ground doesn't stray too far from the norm, but instead of holding a button to run like many other games, here it's momentum-based. Working up to a sprint requires plenty of space, which the game wasn't always kind enough to supply. In spots where there was lots of ground leading up to a longer jump, if you didn't wait until the absolute last second to hit B, you were pretty much guaranteed a good skewering in a spike pit or worse. Jumping from standing wasn't much better either. It's hard to convey unless you've experienced it for yourself, but between pressing the button and seeing Ardy respond on screen, there's a tiny bit of lag that threw me off. My best guess about that unresponsiveness is all of Ardy's gorgeous animation frames I praised earlier, with the issue often becoming deadly when I had to do multiple actions in a row. A great example of this was in the Ancient Pyramid stage. In order to keep up with a moving platform beneath me in one part, I had to duck under spikes and then stand up and jump over several blocks in sequence. By the second or third jump, the platform was breaking off ahead of me, and more often than not, I couldn't catch up in time. There were several instances like this that slowed my progress to a snail's pace, which you can imagine didn't translate into the greatest experience for me. There are also some unique movements involving Ardy's tail that felt dreadful to use. I mentioned that the B button jumps, but if you press and hold B a second time in the air, Ardy's tail pops out below him. The two ways the game expects you to use this is making longer jumps and attacking enemies. The first time I saw this move in action, I immediately thought of Scrooge's pogo stick and NES DuckTales as an exemplar of this idea working wonderfully. Here though, there's a glaring problem with transitioning to tail mode because it takes longer than you'd think to queue up. Adapting to that pause was a perpetual struggle for me, not to mention that it harshly punished my last-minute decision-making. Needing to think ahead was awfully cruel in a game filled with blind jumps and enemies that bust in out of nowhere. It should come as no surprise that situations like these almost always ended in tragedy, especially the first time through a stage. Even as time wound on and I learned the levels a bit more, try as I might, the pogo tail just didn't bother to trigger fast enough or sometimes even at all. I know for a fact I was making the correct controller inputs, but for reasons I could never suss out completely, that tail stayed tucked away instead of doing its job more often than not. Even Nintendo Power Magazine's blurb about Ardy Lightfoot states that the controls take some getting used to. This issue came out over a year after the game released in North America, which is very telling about how consumers probably received it. In my case, this sporadic control responsiveness made my every move feel like a gamble, serving to breed distrust and fuel frustration over the course of my entire playthrough. I often found myself wishing for ways to get out of using the pogo tail, but the developers must have been super proud of it since it's enmeshed in virtually every moment of the adventure. There are long sections of spikes that can only be passed over by way of moving targets too spread out for the normal jump. Other situations force you to use it by bouncing on Visconti's minions across large gaps since they can't be touched otherwise. There are countless other examples, but the truth of the matter was that I had to use this move whether I wanted to or not. There's no doubt in my mind that the number of times I fell short while jumping or got hurt by a monster I was trying to kill was well into the hundreds by the time I finished the game. With all of that well considered though, I do have to give credit where credit is due. When the pogo tail worked as intended, it felt great to use. Unfortunately, those fleeting, blissful moments where I got to experience the developer's intended vision were completely overshadowed by unpredictable execution as well as questionable hit detection. Thankfully, there's a secondary method to kill monsters. Earlier, I said that Peck can be used as a projectile attack, though this wasn't anywhere near a perfect solution for my combat woes. Peck's only effective against a handful of enemies since most aren't even fazed by him, and bosses don't break a sweat either. He's awesome against Visconti's band members, but very hard to aim. They're small for one, but the wide loop Peck travels in is awful. Unless you're right up in the face of the enemy you're trying to eliminate, he seems to circle right around the target. If you miss, you have to wait for him to fully return before sending him out again, and by that point, it's usually too late. It's also worth mentioning that between Peck's horizontal coverage and the pogo tail, there wasn't really any way to defend against stuff coming at you from above. With how many long vertical climbs there are here, Ardy and Peck were a pair of sitting ducks if anything swooped in from the top of the screen. This next bit might seem a little nitpicky, but I also found it kinda tough to tell when attacking with Peck was successful. When he contacts an enemy, there's zero fanfare. No over-the-top explosion, no eating animation, no noise, no nothing. The only feedback you get is the enemy disappearing, which can be hard to discern if there's a lot going on. While I liked the idea of being able to chow down on monsters with Peck, it became increasingly clear that his true potential as a mean blue eating machine would never be fully realized during my playthrough. Getting hit causes him to disturbingly dissipate into nothingness. Considering how much I got hurt fumbling around with the controls, Peck became more of an extra hit point to me than anything else. I appreciated how the developers tried to build on his role by giving him some other cool abilities. He could morph into an adorable little rock muncher to open up passageways or a hot air balloon to cross over large gaps. Unfortunately, these were only available in select areas of a handful of stages across the entire game. I would have loved to see these ideas tapped into more, especially since I often found myself fantasizing about calling up Floating Peck to coast over some stretches that made me want to pull my hair out. This might have made certain parts of the game too easy, but at least it would have provided a welcome respite from the control jank that plagued my playthrough. The manual alludes to another interesting tidbit that I wasn't able to make sense of. It says that Ardy can increase his tail jumping power by puffing up Peck in the air. I'd love to know if anyone out there was able to get this to work because what it meant was completely lost on me. Shorter stage lengths made many of these frustrating aspects mildly more palatable. Even though 2 or 3 chapters might take place in the same general area, breaking them up into smaller chunks compensated for some of their more grueling aspects. Another big plus was the unlimited continues. Getting to the end of a stage and knowing I'd never have to play through it again was hugely motivating. All of the reasons Ardy Lightfoot felt difficult to me were outside of my control, so having unlimited continues gave me permission to throw attempt after attempt at the wall until something stuck. It didn't matter if I was sloppy about it or not, as long as I eventually got the win. If the continues had been limited here, I honestly don't think I would have bothered trying to finish this one. For difficult games with a learning curve that I can chip away at, getting kicked back to the title screen to try again is a small setback on the way to eventual victory. There's incremental progress being made in those situations, which is more than enough to stoke my perseverance and keep me interested in pushing forward. For a game like Ardy Lightfoot, where no amount of practice seemed to improve my skill with the controls or other gameplay elements, Seeing that title screen too many times would have drained every last bit of hope from my soul and possibly caused me to throw the cartridge into traffic. Now, this game does throw the player a couple of bones, like being more than generous with extra lives. You can find them regularly in chests or collect 100 stars to add one to your total. Chests also return Peck to the land of the living from whatever dimension he disintegrates into when he dies. There were 1 or 2 opportunities to spring him from his prison in most stages, but given my track record with getting hit every 5 seconds, I would have loved additional chances to bring him back. This tiny list of positives falls very short of making the experience anywhere near cushy, though there's one piece of tech at Ardy's disposal that's very overpowered. The invisibility cloak makes you completely invulnerable while it's active. This should have been a dream come true, especially considering that the window you can have it out for is pretty long. It did come with some drawbacks, like how there's no real feedback to let you know when your time is up. You just have to get a feel for it, which yielded mixed results for me. The other limitation is that to use it, you have to be standing still. This was extremely handy when I'd memorized boss or enemy patterns and knew when to unfurl it, but in normal play where I needed to react quickly, it was useless. This was because instead of assigning it to one of the unused buttons on the controller for fast deployment, someone thought it would be a better idea to hold up to use it instead. It takes about a whole second of holding up for the cloak to show up, meaning that just like almost everything else in this game, it comes with a delay and all of the problems that come along with that. In my case, I only discovered the invincibility cloak very late. I'm a big fan of reading manuals thoroughly to know what's at my disposal when tackling a new-to-me game. The manual's list of controls was so blandly displayed here that I'm pretty sure I just skimmed through the D-pad controls and assumed they moved the character around like they do in 90% of other games. The description for the cloak is there in black and white, but I missed it and ended up playing most of the game without this perk. Honestly, for a Super Nintendo title that's this pretty, its North American manual sure is plain. The Japanese booklet, on the other hand, is loaded with illustrations and what I'm assuming are more in-depth explanations about game mechanics that seem glossed over or altogether absent in the English version. I haven't even mentioned the gorgeous comic strip at the back either. Its panels show the introduction where Ardy and Peck retrieve the stone tablet, as well as the conversation with Nina and her grandfather's interpretation that sets the adventure into motion. It's definitely worth a look if you're into this sort of thing, but it's entirely missing from the English manual too. Some big highlights in Ardy Lightfoot were the boss fights. While some of them are the regular old tried and tested scenarios where you jump on something until it expires, there are a couple of others involving problem-solving elements that go beyond animal-on-animal violence. My favorite was the fight with Katri. You have to hop on switches to trigger a corresponding colored glove to punch her, which was admittedly much easier said than done. She's also retaliating with the same strategy and usually acted way faster than I could anticipate. The trials I faced fighting this cat off were a drop in the bucket compared to the misery of the final boss fight. There was something finicky about the hit detection here that was really nasty. I won't spoil the whole encounter, but the expectation for a good deal of it is that you have to land well-timed and well-positioned pogo-tail jumps on Visconti. He's towering at the top of the screen, and you have a very short window to get in and get out. I'm not joking when I say that literally half of my playthrough was spent on this fight alone. It's obviously not impossible to do because I eventually won, but between the intermittent pogo tail and the short boss vulnerability window, my frustrations eventually boiled over. If there's one thing that put the final nail in the coffin for me with this game, it was this fight and all of the horrors it wrought. Ardy Lightfoot's unique storytelling and beautiful graphics convinced me that it might be another solid SNES recommendation, but it didn't take long for its sharp pixels to start slicing into my composure. The disconnect between my intentions and what I was seeing happen on screen never quite converged. In fact, it only compounded into mistrust that left me flailing until after the credit sequence. Even Nintendo Power felt like its cartoony graphics were one of the only things worth highlighting as a selling feature for this game. Could this have been a clue? Sometimes what you don't say echoes louder than words.